the way to see invisible data is first to know and understand that these cultural norms are present all the time, everywhere. And when you are unfamiliar with a certain culture, those invisible norms go unnoticed.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. I'm your host, Michael Palmer, and today's show is going to be a fantastic one. Our guest is a cross-cultural workplace consultant and author of The Business of We, the proven three-step process for closing the gap between us and them in your workplace. Laura Kriska is on the podcast, and just to let you know, we had some technical issues at the beginning, which is why we jumped straight into the interview. I start off with asking Laura about her unique career journey, and here's her answer. Enjoy the conversation.
My work started in Japan. It's a little surprising to people when they see me. I am a middle-aged white woman, and when I was a young white woman, I went to work in the Tokyo headquarters of Honda Motor Company. 実は私は日本に生まれました, which is to say, I was born in Japan. And I grew up in the United States, but I was really interested in Japan. And so at age 22, my first real professional job, I was the only American woman working with several thousand Japanese colleagues. And so I very much was the them in the us versus them dynamic. And I started to understand how much relationships with people who are different from yourself, how critical that is for a successful workplace. I learned that through my own experiences, and then I started helping other people in my job as a cross-cultural consultant. I've spent more than 25 years facilitating this relationship building among people from very different backgrounds.
Amazing. I mean, just that experience in itself must have been an incredible obstacle for you to overcome. I mean, the cultural differences alone, the gender differences, and shaping your beliefs and your future. What were some of the greatest challenges that you faced early on in that experience?
That's such a great question, Michael. So when I went to Tokyo, I was, as I said, 22, and I was absolutely so excited to be there. I was very full of myself at that age, thinking I could do anything, yet I was deeply unprepared. And by that, I mean, I thought that I knew what I was doing. You know, I speak some Japanese. I really wanted to be in Japan, but I had no idea of the cultural rules inside any organization. It could be Australian or Canadian or US. You know, every corporation has visible and invisible norms of behavior. And I kind of just walked in there with the confidence of a homegrown American and thought that I knew everything and how to be successful. And so I employed various techniques that any of us might employ. I used my language skills. I tried to build relationships. And within the first week of working, I had irritated the most important colleague in my department. And that was because I was using strategies that were appropriate for US culture and were not appropriate for Japanese culture. So for example, in US culture, we're taught from a very young age, treat everybody the same. Don't pay attention to differences. And so I treated all of my colleagues the same. And I was polite, I was respectful. But what I failed to notice is that many countries, Japan included, really pay attention to the hierarchy, especially as it relates to years of service in an organization. So that in this one colleague's case, she had been working in Honda for many years, had dedicated, her professional life to this company. And I walked in and behaved as her equal. And that was irritating to her. And then we had trouble for a year because I was assuming this level of connection and egalitarian kind of relationship that didn't exist. And that was my failure to pay attention to this invisible hierarchical value system that is really important in that country and tends not to be as important, for example, in the United States.
Mm. And when you identified that, I mean, it sounds like you could spend a whole lifetime trying to figure out and navigate that. How did you deal with it?
So I have what I call the we building superpower. Would you like to know what the we building superpower is?
I think our listeners would.
The we building superpower is the ability to see invisible information, the ability to see invisible cultural data. And the way to see invisible data is first to know and understand that these cultural norms are present all the time, everywhere. And when you are unfamiliar with a certain culture, those invisible norms go unnoticed. Usually when I ask people for examples of cultural differences, they'll give me an example of something they can see. For example, people driving on one side of the road or the other, or what people wear. These are visible indicators. But there's so much invisible information, when to speak up, how strongly to disagree with a boss, whether to accept an offer when somebody offers you a drink or beverages. There are cultures where you're supposed to say, oh, no, thank you. And then on the second or third offer, you say, fine, I'll have some tea or something like that. So these invisible cultural pieces of information are all around us all the time. And there is a concept developed by an anthropologist named Edward Hall. And his idea was using this idea of the cultural iceberg, and that there is part that you can see, as we just talked about, and then there's all this information below the surface. And so going back to the idea of the we building superpower is using this idea of the iceberg in any situation to understand that even though you might not see something, there could be important data that you need to find out. So in my case, when I was in Japan, I was only paying attention to what I could see and hear. And what I failed to do was look for markers of hierarchy. When I walked into my new office, the first question I should have had in my mind was, who is the most senior person in this office? And how can I develop my relationship by just acknowledging her seniority? Some simple statement that shows a little tiny bit of deference to the years of service that she had contributed. And so if we use this idea of the cultural iceberg, we become aware that we don't see information. And then in our work lives, especially when we have diverse workplaces, what's so important is spending face-to-face time with others so that we develop relationships, and those relationships will provide that invisible information, if that makes sense to you. It is through our kind of effort and time that we can begin to see things we otherwise were not noticing.
I think this really is an interesting point. And I would imagine, and listener, you may be thinking, oh, gee, these are examples of very large organizations, really big differences in culture. It's someone from America living in Japan. But the reality is that in small business, this is what's at play. And as well, our marketplace of the people that we work with, not only our clients, but our staff members, maybe people that we work with as contractors to our business, often come from, it's a global economy. It's a global world that we live in with all of these different things happening all around us. And what we do know is that there's discontent or challenges. It's like, oh, gee, that person's difficult to work with, or, why can't I find good people to do the work, and why won't they do it a certain way? Well, the reason is because of some of these. This is I think, the key to understanding why things are not harmonious and how you can start to move the dial. And by the sounds of it, this is not, oh, gee, let's just press a button, add some water, and have this thing instantly be fixed. This is about paying attention and doing the tedious work that needs to get done. It's free, as you say, which is exciting, but it is tedious, and there is an investment that our listener needs to make.
And I'm going to push back just a little bit, Michael. It may seem tedious, but I have found in most cases, there are rewards to spending time and effort to see invisible data. In fact, it can be really fun and rewarding. Let me give you an example that is more applicable to maybe people that might be listening to us in terms of the kind of us versus them dynamics that happen in the workplace regarding people's names. Right? This is as our workplaces have grown more and more diverse, and certainly in my lifetime, what I see in the workplace are lots of different people from different backgrounds, and we see the variety of their backgrounds sometimes manifested in people's names and what they are called. And I'm using this example too because it came up in the news this week with a pretty big story with a company called Basecamp. So here's what I've noticed. A lot of people, your name's Michael, my name's Laura. You work with someone named Dave. My husband's name is Patrick. If we were to look on a list of, Canada's, top 200 names or, the most popular names in the US, these are names that are going to appear on these lists, correct?
Yes.
No mistake. But when people have names that don't show up on that top 200 or 500 or 1,000, when they have names that are quite different, then we can apply this idea of the iceberg I was talking about earlier. One of the things I have discovered through my relationship with people who have names that don't fit the cultural dominant norm in the North America, what I've heard is that, they'll say things like, I got teased for my name, or people made fun of me, or I didn't fit in. I felt other. I felt like a them. So I'm going to, for many people, we all got teased for our names. But, again, names like Laura and Michael, there are lots of Michaels and there are lots of Lauras. So if someone was going to tease me, they're teasing a bunch of people. And again, the idea of what's under the surface. So when you have a name that might not be easy to pronounce for the cultural majority, it's a way that people feel left out. So one of the very basic rules I ask every person in the 21st century workplace, especially leaders, if you want to have an inclusive workplace, then please do the work to find out, first of all, what people want to be called, and then say it correctly and make sure everyone in the company is saying those names correctly and model that. through your leadership by making sure you're not, making fun of anybody's name, you're not mispronouncing anybody's name. I mean, I think it's basic inclusive behavior that everyone in the company is called by the name and that they want to be called by. And so going to this story of Basecamp was in the news this past week. There was an announcement by the founders that they were no longer going to let people have political conversations. These were sensitive and distracting. And this kind of blew up to a big issue. And in a recent article I read about it, apparently the company started off with good intentions in terms of inclusion and diversity and had looked into the practices that the company had, done an internal effort to try to understand, are we being exclusive? What are practices that we could use to make our company more inclusive? And what I read is that they had been keeping an informal list of, quote, funny names. Right? This is a relatively small tech company. And over the years, apparently, they had this ongoing list. I don't know what form the list took. I don't know if it was written down. But apparently, this list of, again, funny names existed. And people inside the company flagged this and said, this probably is not consistent with our wish to be an inclusive, equitable organization. And this is what led to the decision to stop having conversations about maybe what they call, sensitive topics. So I read this with great curiosity. Again, I'm just an outsider. I don't know all the details, but it goes back to this idea that when you are in the cultural majority of your organization, you're what I call on the home team. And Michael, what does the home team have?
Advantage.
There we go. It's not a difficult concept. So when I worked in Tokyo at Honda Motor Company, the home team, and the home team is the group at the top with access to money and power, right? So anybody listening, I think I would ask, what are the characteristics of the home team in your organization? So when I think about Honda, I would characterize the home team. I would say that it was mostly almost entirely male, Japanese, and middle-aged. And I'll add straight. I don't know for sure, but I'm going to make an assumption there. And so I'm not Japanese, I'm not male, and at the time I wasn't middle-aged. And so I was very far from that center of power. I didn't identify with that home team. So if you identify with the home team, even if you are not a person with a lot of power, you have kind of implicit access to that. Other people might look at you as having association with the home team. But going back to the idea of the listeners, if you look at your home team and you see a very homogeneous group of people, that's a yellow flag. And you should pay attention to that, the makeup of your organization and the home team in particular, and then take steps to make sure that if you do have a home team, your home team is broadening the circle of who belongs in the organization. And that means look at, who is hanging out with whom, who's having lunch together, who is being consulted. So whose name is known in the company. So again, if we go back to this idea of names that might be outside of the norm in a particular area, I would want the leaders and the home team leaders to make sure they are practicing inclusion by knowing and saying those names correctly at the minimum. But the idea, of course, is to broaden the idea of who belongs in this company. Are people named Michael and Laura, are they the people who feel like they belong because people that look like them are represented at the top? Or is there more diversity in our organization? And if you don't have that diversity reflected, at the top levels of the organization, which, ideally that's how it looks in a company, reflecting the employee base and the customer base. If you don't have that reflected, thinking about how that can be worked towards, but having the people, the home team members, make an effort to look internally and think about ways on a daily basis that they can promote a we culture, not an us and them culture. So a we culture, behavior that's consistent with a we culture, would be to be able to call any person by name, no matter what their names are, in the office. It would be engaging with a wide range of people in the company, not only people who have similar identity characteristics to you. So those are examples of what I call we building behaviors that can lead to a we culture.
It's fascinating. And, just that one example where you think of belonging, and if someone feels that they're on the we team, or they belong, they feel that they're on the home team, and everyone can feel that they're on the home team, they feel like they belong. I mean, there's a lot of people who don't feel that they belong, and the cost of that to any organization is a hidden cost. When they don't feel they belong, I mean, what are they doing every day? They're coming to your office, even if you're a two-person business. That one person that works is not belong, because maybe the business owner is the home team, and they don't respect or haven't thought about, and it's maybe that they don't even know, they haven't paid attention to this cultural iceberg, and yet that person that works for them is driving there saying, well, I don't belong, and gee, where am I going to go where I can belong? I mean, if a person feels like they can belong, the difference in their work, the difference in the experience of everyone involved is so much better.
I so agree with you, Michael. And what I've noticed is that to make people feel like they belong really starts with small gestures, such as saying their names correctly, making an attempt to start to actively build trust with people who might seem very different from you. And what I've noticed is that when we start making small gestures, engaging in self-disclosure, appropriate self-disclosure, often we discover we have way more in common than we thought. And it's this perceived notion of difference that really separates us, not actual difference.
So true. And, we live in a busy world, fast moving, and often I think there's potential to not pay attention to these things. Is that, would you say, what would be the things that would have people not do something like this? I mean, in just this short conversation, it's very clear. It's almost a context shift of going, hey, if I have a home and I'm inviting guests into my home, am I going to want to have a home or have them have an experience where they don't feel like they belong? Well, they're never going to come back. If I like those people, I want them to come. What would I do? I would do simple things to make them feel like, hey, is there anything I can get you? Make sure I know their name, simple things, but maybe we're not thinking enough or taking enough time to think about these things.
Yeah, I love the idea of thinking about having people to your home. And I can give you a kind of example I've noticed that changed through the generations. I often ask people for us versus them gaps. And someone in a recent webinar gave the example of being vegetarian. And being vegetarian in 2021 is pretty common. When I was coming up in the world, it still was, you couldn't go to a school lunch cafeteria and find vegetarian options, as I remember. And so the gap between people who are vegetarians and are not vegetarians has really narrowed. And it's an example of the kind of thing people ask these days. If you're coming to their house and they would say, well, are there any, food preferences or allergies or things like that? Like, I never remember people saying that when I was growing up. And it's just a small example of paying attention to an invisible data point. So you and I just met a little while ago. We saw each other. Now we're speaking, but it's invisible to me to know what your eating preferences are. I don't know if you're vegetarian, if you have allergies, right? That's a very simple example of an invisible data point. And so if I was inviting your family to my home and I was going to prepare food, I would simply ask you, do you have that? I would try to access that piece of invisible information. And that's what we builders do on a much bigger scale in the workplace all the time.
It's magical when someone pays attention to somebody else and actually, puts an effort into caring. I mean, at that level, the magic that can happen between two people or multiple people, I think of my own example is vegan. I'm not a vegan. We have a few family members that are vegan. And it's like this mysterious thing. And it would almost be, you can just imagine their experience when everybody else is not vegan. And the conversations, the comments, the whatever, they wouldn't have felt welcome. It's like, oh dear, I don't like that food, or, gee, that's not very exciting. Whatever it is. I mean, I'm talking about family, but just overlay that with in the workplace with there's going to be people potentially that have these different dietary choices they're making. Well, when they started to bring, it's like, well, what do you do? If you're interested, it's like, well, what are you doing? How is that working? My mom has actually been living with us because of COVID, and she's actually thrown herself into exploration of vegan eating. And so that in itself is altering the relationship between those other family members, because now it's like, well, geez, we're doing this and we're exploring, but that's really a gift, not only to us, but to them, and will help us all feel like we belong more so to this family.
Yeah, I love using food as this example of cultural difference and us versus them, because it follows along exactly with the ideas in my book, which is that we have these various dynamics. So if we stick with the food example, vegan versus, say, regular old carnivores, I would say that your mother is becoming culturally fluid. She is becoming the go-between. Because it sounds like she's somebody who does eat meat, but that has explored this other cultural, norm of having much more narrow focus on what someone can eat. And her ability and knowledge is bringing people together. You could argue maybe she would prepare food that would make the vegan eating people much more welcome and excited about a dinner party, for example, as opposed to maybe if you made a big barbecue and they showed up and they were like, all right, I guess we have to eat potato chips or something.
She would be, just thinking, I would call her a flavorist.
Oh.
Her big thing is all about flavor and making sure the food tastes amazing. So she's a bit of a scientist in her own right around figuring out how it works and what makes something flavorful. And so if you can combine flavor with health and anything like that, then it's actually it creates an environment that's more inviting to all people. I mean, she's doing she's a wee builder in the kitchen.
Exactly.
Right?
And really, food is one of the mechanisms that I suggest when people are looking for ways to explore, to broaden their cultural perspective, and to find ways into new relationships with people from different backgrounds. This is so important. I think so many of us who do identify with the home team in our own countries, and as I do, it's so valuable for everyone when we bridge outside of our familiar circles and build relationships. And it's hard. You were asking earlier, why do people not do this? And I've been asking my clients, and I've been doing a lot of webinars this past year. And there are, I would say, 2 or 3 big reasons. One is just working from home makes it hard because face-to-face encounters are really the important mechanism. But a lot of people are fearful of doing or saying the wrong thing. Mm-hmm. I know in my neighborhood, I live in Brooklyn, New York, and, almost a year ago this time when there was a lot of Black Lives Matter protests and many, many signs went up into windows around my neighborhood. And that's encouraging to see, people posting things on social media. It's much better than not having those things. But a year out, I'm noticing a dearth of action. And when I ask people about this, when I ask them, why haven't you done more? Or what's the barrier to doing more than putting up a sign? They say, I don't want to say or do the wrong thing. I don't know how to build relationships, for example, with Black people. I don't know where to go. I don't know, how to do this. Where do I start? And I think it's, when you've lived a lifetime in a very homogeneous way, there's a lot of concern about branching out. And so I think people want to and understand that relationships are so important. This, I believe, will be our salvation away from division, away from fear, away from hate, and toward unity and toward a multiracial, multi-ethnic coalition. But so many people on the home team are not taking the actions they need to do, and they're fearful. So what I suggest to people is think about, I'm using this idea of the word fresh as an acronym. So family, religion, eating, shopping, and hobbies. And so using these avenues in our real life. So if you are practicing a religion, think about researching the same religion, your faith, maybe in a different part of your neighborhood or town where people of color practice your religion, and go to that place rather than the same place that you always go. Again, with food, eating, expand your circle. Try shopping at a grocery store that might attract a different clientele that is more diverse than the same old place that you go to all the time. Hobbies are another great avenue. I know people who have deliberately sought out a soccer team. Here in Brooklyn, there are so many groups that get together, grown-ups that are not professionals that gather to play soccer in Prospect Park. And it's not hard to find a group that is not all white. And if you go, you have to research these things, and then you have to take the step to go there. And that's what's hard for people. It's a little risky. It might feel vulnerable. But unless people engage in these types of actions, we will not develop the relationships that we must have. And this is what rebuilding that I advocate has 3 categories. There are safe actions, challenging actions, and radical actions. Safe actions are things like putting up a Black Lives Matter sign in your window. It's reading The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. These are good things to do, but they're not going to change our trajectory. We must have action in the challenging category. Challenging means something that's face to face. And that means there's some vulnerability, there's some risk. You might feel unwelcome. Somebody might say, I don't want to do this thing, and you have to be prepared for that. Radical actions are not for everyone. That's making a long-term commitment where you are the minority in a particular group. So using this idea of fresh, using your family connections, religion, eating, some where you eat or get your food, shopping or hobbies. These are all avenues that we have in our lives already. And so choosing just one of the many choices that you make in a week, the thousands of choices that a human makes, and think about trying to adjust just one action that could put you on a path for broadening your experience, for broadening your circle of the humans that you come into contact, and then looking for opportunities to expand those into a relationship that might be very meaningful in your life.
We often talk about building a business you love. I feel like this conversation is about building a life you love, and the actions taken here not only will help you in your business, with your staff, with your employees or customers, but it will help you expand yourself as a human being, which is so, I think, exciting and gratifying and, multi-faceted in terms of the results it's going to get back. Tell us a little bit about your book. I know there's lots of resources, questions you have. There's all sorts of ways that you can bring to your life and your business to actually implement these things. You mentioned also the cost is very low for implementing these things. I just absolutely love fresh. I mean, it's exciting to even think about that. Maybe it's COVID working on me, but like, oh my goodness, I could go and take my hobby to some brand new place with new people. It's like, wow, exciting. Well, tell us about the book and what people will get out of it when they get a copy of that.
Sure. Well, I'll say that one of the most important tools in my book is the us versus them self-assessment, which is 10 yes or no questions. I'll say also that this is a free resource. Anyone can download this list of questions from my website, which is lauraKriska.com. It's also in the book. But this list of 10 questions measures a person's level of integration with a particular target culture. So if you are a white person who wants to expand your firsthand experience with Black culture, you can measure yourself. You get to decide what the culture is. If, I give this test to anybody who's looking to expand their experience, you can use it in so many different ways. I've been using it recently to understand Generation Z, because I have 3 teenagers and there's a big culture gap. So the 10 questions are very general and they give you a number. It's like stepping on a scale. You see a number. It's not the only number that matters, but it is a number. It's a way to measure yourself. And if your score is quite low, then it's an indicator that you need to spend some time and energy trying to understand and engage with people that have experience with that cultural group. And these yes or no questions are, you can take this assessment in 1 minute, but the questions themselves can become action points for somebody who wants to take action. So the first question is something like, have you ever met somebody from this cultural group? And then they get more and more in depth. And so then these questions are a tool I hope will be used by many people over and over and over again. And it's one of the ways that I hope will provide a mechanism for people who want change. I think there are so many people who want change but don't know what to do. And so for anybody like that, I would suggest taking a look at that self-assessment. Take a look at my book. The book clearly is written as a business book. It's the business of we. But Michael, this was written and the tools are for anyone. They're not at all limited to the business community. And so it is my great wish to inspire a we-building revolution where people take action to bridge us versus them gaps that are relevant in their lives. But I can't do it alone. I need your help, Michael. I need all of your listeners to help. And I genuinely feel like this will be beneficial to our business lives and, as you said, to our lives. So I encourage your listeners to check these resources out.
I love it. I absolutely love it. And I think the resource, the test that people can access, I mean, there's different generations that you work with, maybe your team that you're working with, or you're wanting to add more people to your business, and they might be from a different generation or a different culture. What an opportunity to take that on. And yes, better human being. What are business made up of? They're made up of human beings. And so you've got to start with you first. And so that's, we can't go to work or expect our people to be great. They got to start with looking inward first. And that's probably the most direct route to creating a world and an environment and a business that you love and a life that you love is build it from inward out. So thank you so much for coming on to our show and sharing your knowledge, your experience with our audience. On behalf of our listener, I thank you greatly.
Thank you, Michael.
And with that, we wrap another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. To learn more about today's wonderful guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.